Welcome everyone who is attending this reading today. We're very pleased to have Rebecca Braun and Ulrike Draesner as our guests. I am Michael Eskin, the publisher of Ulrike Draesner's forthcoming novel, Channel Swimmer, her very first novel in English. We're based in New York, Upper West Side Philosophers, Inc. We're very happy and very proud to have both the author and the translator with us today, who will give us a wonderful sense of the novel by reading parts of it and engaging in a conversation about this novel. And without further ado, I'll just ask a couple of questions before we get into the reading itself. Ulrike, welcome, and thank you so much for participating. And could you tell us a little bit about this wonderful novel about love, personal development, swimming, crossing the English Channel, England, Germany, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, thank you. Hello to everybody, and thank you for having me. That is a really not complicated question you just asked, Michael. I could probably talk for ages about it, which I shouldn't do. So perhaps it's a good idea to tell you of how I came to write this novel. I had this idea, I wanted to write fiction about the four elements and try to invent stories. And I studied in England in the 80s, and somehow I came across a very weird habit, at least it seemed to be a weird habit to me. People try to swim across the channel without any means to support them. So it's just your bathing suit and a bit of kind of fat cream for your skin, and that's all you are allowed to take with you. And I thought that this was a really amazing endeavor. Because it means that you test out the limits of your physical strength, but also the limits of your willpower and the energy that really drives you. And it's a contest of your mind against the water. And that's what I thought at the beginning. And I wanted to write about it. And I had an idea about my protagonist, an elderly man in a crisis, and he wants to kind of probe himself in the water. And it was easy to get him into the water. And I started to write that story, I think about like 2004 or 5. And then I ran into a real problem. I didn't know how to get him out of this channel again. I wasn't even sure whether he would survive his journey. And it took another kind of more than a decade, actually, till I knew what to do. And I lived in England at the time again and did some research in Dover and talked to channel swimmers and started to learn to admire what they do. And then I was able to finish the novel. And of course, I don't want to give away the end, which would be difficult in a way anyway, because there are a couple of endings now. So perhaps that's for the start.
Well, then, no pun intended, let's dive into the novel itself and give the readers a sense of the writing before we continue our conversation. Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to sharing a few different passages from the novel, but we're starting off with one that's reasonably close to the beginning, and it gives people a way into the fantastic love story that it turns out is swimming alongside Charles as he undertakes his channel crossing, and it bubbles up to the surface and accompanies the narrative all the way. So this is kind of introducing the first time that Charles meets the women who are going to be important in the story, and he's with his friend Silas. So I'll start here. He was lying flat on his back. Something tickled his nose, and slowly he climbed out of a red gold syrup of exhaustion and sun, back into a world full of voices. Over him, near enough to kiss, hovered a familiar face. It grinned. Charles, on his towel at the side of a swimming pool on Silt Island, jumped up. Or he wanted to jump up, but actually only managed to wrench open his eyes. Silas had approached the girl. From England, what's more. Quite a coincidence. He wanted to introduce Charles to her. That he should also present the girl to Charles was logical. Nobody thought anything of it. Only later did it seem poignant. Silas said, "My best friend." The girl said, "And that's Abigail, my sister." Charles, either still half in his dreams or plunged back into them, turned his head. Yes, there really was another person there between the water and dry land. Blonde, freckles on her nose, curious. At least that was the pose she struck. "See you at the ice cream parlour," said Silas, and straightened up. So did the girls. Charles blinked, taking in the entire length of the first English girl's legs, right up to her bikini bottom. It was blue, a stretch of bare belly, a red spaghetti strap top, medium-sized chest. Abigail said, "Seems pretty lazy, your friend." If it were true that everything is decided in the first 3 seconds, then it was all over already. A tempting thought. All the same, one thing was true. He had to thank Silas for Maud. Silas and, strictly speaking, Abigail. She had spotted the English lads at the pool days earlier, had convinced Maud to hang about on the bench by the diving tower. Until Silas finally did the decent thing. Equals what Abby wanted. The boys should come over to the girls. She admitted as much after a few days. The men daring and self-assured, the ladies meekly waiting to be courted. Those old roles. And this in 1976? Exactly, said Abby. England had its music, and Glastonbury, and its weed, and Portobello Road. It was fine if a few traditions were left untouched. Abby was a chemist, a trainee teacher. She liked how all the elements were ordered, the laws of nature immutable. Otherwise, she was like her younger sister. That's what everyone said. And everyone meant something different by it. Charles thought that nature had practiced for the second on the first. Maud said it was a cheek even to think such a thing, let alone go and say it. Abby was insulted when she heard, insulted straight out, and then again later that evening, when she privately pondered Charles's words in the bathroom and found herself thinking, "Damn nature." By this, she was less concerned with the equation of genes equals the past, as with her heart equals right now. Only Silas thought nothing at all. Charles's concern with what Silas might be thinking disappeared. He didn't even notice himself not noticing. He simply forgot about it, looked into those big light brown Maud eyes, those big light blue Abigail eyes, as if he were alone in the world with the girls, and disappeared in their gazes. The eyes were accompanied twice over by an equally large, pretty mouth, in which he would also have liked to disappear twice over. With Abby, her forehead and chin were crowded out by her eyes and mouth. A shame, but pretty nevertheless. Abby loved large floral print dresses that only women like. Men didn't notice these garments, not the same way they noticed shorts or spaghetti tops. Maud said Abby was the quieter of the two of them, more intelligent in any case. 2 days after they had met, the four of them were sitting together in Westerland's most expensive restaurant and eating lobster, thanks to an unexpected gift from Silas's father, Tex. Charles could have raised his eyebrows at the things Silas shared with his father. Met some girls, etc. Had he rung him up just to tell him? But in actual fact, he didn't think anything of it, and Tex had probably given his son the money just like that, in advance for a special occasion. Silas put his arm around the back of Maud's chair, and less than an hour later on the path through the dunes, around Maud. Abby, wearing Maud's spaghetti top and miniskirt, told Charles, who was carefully keeping his arms to himself, that he would appear to have the emotional life of a teaspoon. Was that being quiet? Not to mention intelligent? Teaspoons get hot, said Maud. Only if you stick them in the cup and let them stir, Abby retorted. They howled with laughter. Nothing would ever again match this kind of humour. They were just 20, and the world not one day older. It was vibrating. They had been swimming in a blend of sugar, kisses, and alcohol. Glasses half full, half empty. They drank straight from the bottle, passed it round from mouth to mouth. The 4 people in the dunes embraced, tried to go a few steps, stumbled, laughed. In the moonlight, the sandy hills resembled disproportionate sea mollusks, their shells shimmering with a mother-of-pearl coating and sporting bizarre snail-like outgrowths and moles that sprouted beards of grass. Even the sometimes too sensible, mannerly Maud was so full of red wine, lobster, and hormones that she no longer cared how much sand was sticking to her hair or breasts. They had barely met, knew nothing about each other beyond what they were sharing and talking about now. There were no mutual friends, no preconceptions. This was happening for the first time in their lives. They gave it no further thought, just took it as a kind of freedom, a fuller existence in the here and now. What a coincidence they had met, a gift. And so things happened as they were meant to happen. They visited each other, took the bus to the south side of the island where the dunes were flatter, hairier, and the island tapered to a point. Once they even trudged out with the guide onto the mudflats. It looked harmless enough. Between mussel shells, worm casts, and with the sun steaming down on them, they wandered about. Inwardly, they were waiting for the evening. It was their release. Maud brought along the music, Charles and Silas, olives, cheese, and wine, Abby, the sticky stuff. The girls swapped around their clothes. They only had 1 pair of shorts and the same bikini tops, just in blue or red. The sun sank late and slowly. They called the music that they played their music for sinking away. Charles held Maud in one arm. Abby sank into his other. Silas lay across them. Charles felt less on the Abby side, but he felt her all the same. Because it wasn't true about the first 3 seconds, because that was always a story cut short.
What a beautiful read, and thank you so much, Rebecca. For a novel to be translated, it really only starts living, especially in the target language, owing to the genius and the skill of the translator. And especially, I think what readers did get from your read is that it's not only translated into English, British English, but there's also an Irish twang to it. So there's local color, there's a regionalism to it that adds a certain lightness, levity, call it humor to it, that doesn't simply exist, at least to my ears, in straightforward British English, which is much more, pardon me for saying this, let's call it staid or stodgy compared to Irish. At least that's how I hear it when I hear it. And the interesting thing to me was, as I reread the novel multiple times, is you can feel it. It's anchored in the region the translator is from. Can you speak to that a little bit, Rebecca? How it was for you to translate someone like Ulrike Draesner, who is obviously a consummate stylist in her native German and renowned as such, who also has been celebrated as such, to translate her into this regional and yet universal English. How did you square the two? How did you deal with that? How did you turn it into this lively and really absolutely palpable story where the personages and characters come alive?
Yeah, thank you so much for those observations and that question, Michael. I guess I suppose, first of all, I want to say that when I first read the book, I was actually in Germany, in Ulrike's flat, as it turns out. And I read it pretty much in one night. And I was so gripped by it. And I just loved the central character, Charles, who for me was a very English central character. And I totally identified in some weird kind of way with this grumpy older man who's kind of at a point in his life where he's just, he says stuff as he thinks it. He's frustrated with life. He's working things through. But through him, these other characters are brought to life, and you start to learn about the different stages in his life. That reading I gave was obviously he's reminiscing back into his younger years, and it became apparent that I was going to have to think about how to translate the, the German rendition of all of these characters' dialogue into English. And they were, of course, in the German original, you have to expect that they're mostly pretty much always speaking English to each other, but I had it in German. So I then had to think about, well, what kind of English would they use? And the characters have a variety of different backgrounds, and it's one of the really interesting kind of sub-themes of the book is this kind of movement across Europe and the way that the UK is linked into mainland Europe. And then there is an Irish dimension, which comes up in Brendan, the ship's pilot, who is, the book is quite explicit at one point, does reference Brendan, the Irish monk who set sail across the sea. And as soon as I encountered Brendan, I was like, well, Brendan is clearly Irish. But there was nothing in the German to give me any, in terms of how Brendan talks, there's nothing there. But it did set me reflecting on, so how am I going to make all of these characters talk? And, the girls are going to be pretty English. Charles is kind of English, but turns out he's got this kind of broader Central European background going on in his family. So I guess it was one of the fun things to do as I went through the revisions, is that first of all, when you're translating, you're just trying to get the basic thrust of what's going on, and get the text first sort of kind of anchored as much as you can into the kind of English that feels right for it. But then as you refine it, you can really start to play out, well, actually, no, I think they'd use these words or this kind of, and we're also moving between the kind of period of the 1970s and pretty much the present day, how younger people spoke back in the 1970s, the kind of slang that they might use in the Oxford context. And that was another thing that I shared with Ulrike, that we both have experienced living and working in Oxford, and the sort of the Oxford College setting, which is important to the backstory as well. So I guess it was just one of the joys of translating, was to really feel I had permission to reinvent these characters. I mean, they had already been invented by Ulrike as authentic character, English and Irish characters, but obviously Ulrike's medium had been German, so she was really helpful in saying, you must do what you think works. So I was given license to play, and I did really live that license to the full, particularly in how I approach Brendan, and I might share that in a reading in a few minutes' time, where I kind of took that to the limits of plausibility, really, in making him quite Irish, even though he has it's also clear from the narrative he's been living in England for a long time. So, but I really had a lot of fun playing with that, and I hope it's something that gives the whole story a particular edge for readers.
Why don't you give us a little bit of Brendan before we continue our conversation?
Sure.
Nicely.
I have to warn you that one of the things that I had to do when making Brendan authentic was allow him to swear. So there are a few expletives in the passage that I'm going to read, but it will also move us along in our conversation, because this is sort of partway through the swim, and it's the first kind of crisis moment where things start to go a little wrong, and it's also the kind of point when you're under pressure that the characters start to maybe revert to type, as I have been known to do. So my own background is I'm Irish, but I lived in England for a long time, and when I used to get very annoyed, I would suddenly sound a lot more Irish. So that's a little bit of what's going on here. Gradually, he noticed the white noise. It wasn't going away. It was increasing. A nasty grating sound had started up now too. He took a deep breath, dived under, 3 feet at most, and yet everything went dark. Differently dark to what he had ever seen. Think, Charles. Something's rolling around above you, too slow moving to be a boat. And that ringing, that scraping? A shark? Nonsense. There weren't any in the channel. This Devil's Strait was too cold for the sensible creatures. Couldn't be a hovercraft either. Too small. In any case, that sort of error, his swim route crossing the path of a regular boat, that would never have happened to the experienced Brendan. Astonished, he realized he ought to be afraid, but he wasn't. Darkness was turning circles above him. It was rustling, hustling, almost smacking its lips. He began to conserve his breath. It wasn't getting any brighter. He seemed caught in the same grind as that thing. He trained his senses on himself once more. Still no signs of panic. Only his head was expanding from lack of air. He saw nothing, so he closed his eyes. He knew which way was up. Didn't he know that anyway? How many minutes can you hold your breath? Depends on the circumstances, said the eager pupil in his head. He found it funny. Not the situation, the eager voice. His chest grew warm. The warmth was branching out to both sides, flowing into his arms. It didn't feel right, but pleasant. He stretched his arms. He flowed after his arms. Something was pulling him. A shirt was floating above him. His head was enormous. His head flowed into the shirt, floated up the left sleeve. Lucky for you that the shirt isn't shrinking, said the voice. It was still there, albeit remarkably tame due to the lack of air. His head followed his hand. His body was weightless. This, too, he found logical. Hand, arm, head slipped up the sleeve. Blue was streaming towards him. Brendan's eyes up close, almost at the same level as him. What the fucking hell? Something was gasping. Him, Charles. So he was still here. Oh, yes! Fuck! The pilot had lowered the lifeboat and rowed over to Charles. Just in time, Charles checked the instinct to grab onto the side of the dinghy. Charles? Yeah. Charles, still spluttering. His skipper had dropped down in the lifeboat to find him easily. Flotsam, said Brendan. Well, Charles was some quick thinker. A corrugated iron roof. Rusty, sharp, cut through your throat if you were stupid enough to get in its way, came at crazy double speed out of nowhere, just careered over damn rain, wind, rubbish, so they hadn't been able to warn him. Diving, the best, only thing he could have done. Brendan said he was proud of him. The rain had worn itself out. It had only been a squall away off. They had got through it. You'll make it, fella, right to the end. Sure? Sure. The waves, softer now than before the bad weather, were licking all around him. Dogs' tongues. Miniature sleeves from a blue shirt. This he could make out clearly. Didn't have to say it, though. The Henry had taken on quite a pitch. Overall, a calming scene. An honourable fish. Well on his way, Charles the fish. He laughed. Brendan, the ancient mariner, had no idea where he had been. He, Charles, had an easy laugh. The dangerous part of the crossing had begun. Yes, his pilot probably thought so too. All Brendan had to do was take a look at his watch. A bit crowded here, Charles said between breaths. He was breathing normally again now, not gasping. His partner for life was rowing along beside him. The Henry accompanied them. No more time to lose. Charles, how he was swimming again. A pity that his ferrying fellow didn't get the crowded joke.
Thank you so much. Again, it's not only a reading, it's a performance. So that's an additional art that is being deployed here. And you're an expert at it. So when you do live readings, I think it will go over really well. Ulrike, may I ask you, how is it for you? For me, it's the first time that somebody has read the novel back to me. And, with every read, I started, I began appreciating the genius of the novel more and more. I liked it very much in German. That's why we acquired it. I liked it even more in German when I read it the second time. I liked it differently when it finally appeared in English on the page, which it is almost meant to be because they're all British characters. And so now hearing it live and read and spoken, because it's so heavy on dialogue as well. So it's a very descriptive book, of which you're a master. But both the nature writing and the psychological description, but it's also very, very heavy on dialogue between the characters. And it all comes out in these interfaces of ekphrases of natural phenomena coupled with these inner visions of the characters themselves, be it Brandon when you switch to personal narration, or authorially speaking, Charles, depending on how you describe it as free and direct discourse, etc. So how is it for you to hear yourself speak back at you and to you in English?
It's so amazing. It's the first time I heard Rebecca and I read it out aloud. And I'm really happy. And thank you so, so much, Rebecca, for the work you've done and how you've done it. I was always sure you were the one who could do it because you have such a wonderful ear for the melody and the humor and the language twisting, which is in the German as well. And when you talked about, how you went about the translation, I just felt that this is so right, especially for this novel. I think that in general, translation, I'm a translator myself, and translation always needs to be a transformation of the so-called original. Because languages are different and people are different and cultures are different. And you need to recreate a work of art in its own right in the other language. So that is why you need to transform, you need to invent. And so I would always be happy to re-encourage and encourage everybody who engages in a project of translating a literary work to feel free to invent and make new choices. And I felt, especially for the channel swimmer, that this is the only way really to deal with it, because right from the beginning, this entire project has always been about translation and transitions. I felt as a writer that my main kind of task, or the one thing I could possibly achieve, was to translate a very physical experience of a 24-hour swim in very cold water through rain and sun in daylight and at night, to translate that into language, and a form of language which would allow readers to kind of co-experience without being forced into the cold water themselves what Charles is going through. And then I did my research, and that happened to be in English. So what I did was a kind of similar process. So I translated a mute body experience and English language into a kind of texture, a carpet of voices and experiences, which happen to be in German, with all these kind of English phrases in between. And then it is a novel of many voices. It's always been that. And you now taking it into English. I'm so glad you didn't decide, to kind of create a homogeneous surface, because this isn't what the German is all about. So you need to reinvent different Irish, English, European tinged voices, and you've done that so wonderfully. So I'm really happy, and I could listen to you much more, and I hope you're going to read more.
Well, yeah, well, we'll hear more. Just to add to this, because most people will obviously either read it in the original or only in English. Probably only the editor or the publisher will have read both. If they
and the translator happens to have read
and
both.
the translator, obviously, and the author.
Yes.
But I simply want to emphasize that for all the inventiveness, and as you said, Ulrike, there is only one way to make a text come alive in a different language from its original, is by being inventive, because there's no complete homology and overlap. At the same time, it is amazingly faithful to the original. So I want to emphasize this. So what you heard just now, and especially these very intricate passages that use technical terms that are descriptive of the minutiae of diving and coming up for air, and all of the language involved in describing a boat, just the accoutrements of a boat. Most people don't know any of this in their original language to begin with, unless they are boating people and or conversant with one or the other domain in their daily lives. So it's very, very faithful, and it's a true rarity that you have absolute fidelity coupled with a very natural inventiveness in the target language. And I think this is what comes across to my ears now, listening to it read out loud, how successfully it has been accomplished. I also wanted to just seg into a different part of our conversation. And I think the prompt was part of that passage. It's a bit crowded here. Mm-hmm. And I'll explain in a second what I mean by this, but picking up on what you just said, Ulrike, it's 24 hours in the life of a man. So we already have a typical microcosmic something happening. It's like you could say it's a couple of days in the life of a man. If you think back to Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, the ultimate allegory of man, humankind versus nature, with nature and or nature, however you want to describe it. So if this is a contemporary masterful repartee to Hemingway, it is by definition also an allegory, a metaphor of something. And as any reader will recognize quite quickly as they start reading the novel, and it came as was evidenced by Rebecca's first passage and first bit, it's also about the past and about youth, not only about old age or the third third of a human life. So as Charles traverses the channel, he also passes in review many things that happened to him, to Maud, to Abby, to Silas, all of the characters mentioned in the past and in the present. So it's much, much larger than just the channel crossing, which becomes a kind of rite of passage, crossing thresholds, entering new spaces, and so on, which takes us to the a bit crowded here, because this is the fulcrum of the novel. The channel crossing may be the allegorical, the figurative fulcrum of the novel, but the plot fulcrum of the novel, it's the bit crowded here. What is this all about? Either of you, can you explain? Just, or don't tip your hand completely, obviously, but a little bit for the reader to understand why it's so crowded there in that water.
Do you want to go
Either
ahead,
you or
Rebecca?
You, Rebecca.
Why is it so crowded in the water? As in, do you want me to give a bit of a sense of what the underlying stories are, or?
Yes, I mean, the novel is about crowdedness in its own way, with memories, with people of different genders.
If you want to have time to think, Rebecca, I can say something as well. I didn't want to push you into it. There are, as Michael mentioned, there are allusions to the past, to music, to pop, and it's a bit crowded here. Really is quite on the first or second page of the novel already. It comes up because Charles thinks of that famous interview between Lady Di and Charles and a person who interviewed them about their marriage, and that's what she said about the crowdedness of the marriage that everybody now knows what she meant. And he thinks of it because he finds himself in a very similar life situation. And I've always been wondering, because I knew somehow, I don't know, intuitively, I wanted to have a man in the sea. Women do channel crossing as well, of course, and they do it very well. But for me, it was always clear the protagonist who had to be in the water would be a man. Nowadays, I think, because I needed to kind of test some of these heroic concepts and actually to rewrite Hemingway as well, because, there is no fish to be fought and there's nothing to be killed. And it's the man himself gets transformed into this fish struggling to survive. But the kind of the person who pulls the strings is a female. It's Maud. She happens to be his wife of, I don't know, 20 or 25 years. And she has come up with quite a challenge of a different kind for him, by a modest proposal which might lead to a certain crowdedness of the marriage involving a third person named Silas, who both of them know very well. And so, and Brendan doesn't know anything about this very, for Charles, very painful and problematic background motivations for his swim. And yeah, the sea is crowded as well with all the rubbish, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's 100% encapsulating what's going on in terms of the sort of different plot levels, I guess. But I'd maybe add to that, to going back to, why was I so gripped? Why did I pretty much stay up all night reading this book when I first had it? And I think there's something really interesting in the way it's quite a short novel, certainly as many German novels go. And it is, on one level, it's, you're just in the head of one guy, as you said, Michael, for a pretty short amount of time. And yet everything that matters is going on. Through you have this access to kind of what it means to live, to be human, to go through all the different stages of life. And he reminisces over all the things that have been like really important and still are important to him now. And through that you see other characters coming into that same ambit, and it's just an incredible. There's an incredible tension between this fast-paced plot where you read it and you kind of read it like a whodunit to start with, because you kind of want to know, will he get to the end or not? I was like so invested. What is going to happen to Charles? I love this guy. He was like not really very lovable, but what's going to happen? And but so much is on the line as you read. You find out more, and you want to know what's going to happen in the love story. So for me, I think this novel just amazingly encapsulates how life can just suck you up, and you can get so invested in things, and it can kind of go at a really fast pace and at a really slow pace, because that's the other thing, is that you feel almost every slogging stroke as Charles is swimming, and so time kind of both goes quite pacily in terms of a reading experience, but it's also going really, really slowly, and it's like the time is stretched. And the nature descriptions are stretched, and your gaze is held on things that you'd never ordinarily see, and I've rarely encountered that in a work of fiction, the way it achieves that kind of double time kind of thing going on. So that was what really caught me as a reader first time round and made me want to translate it.
Charles, if I remember correctly, in terms of his professional designation, is a paleontologist or anthropologist or paleontologist? Well,
he is a biologist, so he deals with cells and research into, the functioning of the human cell.
Especially old organisms, correct? Or is
no, he's only interested. He goes to Oxford to the museum. That is
why you think that. Because he works in Oxford. Yeah. And everything just melds in terms of his professional life. He goes to his lab, to his office when he's in Oxford. I was wondering whether, the smaller the organism you study, the more you have to go back chronologically, if you will, or etiologically, or anthropologically, into the past of each individual ontogenetic development of an organism. Does this make sense? So the question of time, the question of the gestation of an organism, of its evolution as an individual as opposed to the species, is ever present in Charles's approach. So there's a kind of echoing or homological relationship between his channel crossing on the one hand at that stage in his life, and everything that happened to him and the other characters that are involved in his life in the course of their lives as part of this larger picture. So could you maybe speak a little bit, and listening to you, I couldn't help thinking of it, a little bit about the larger dimension of this novel as a work of art on the one hand, and we must never forget whatever novels are, they're primarily works of art, and then they're everything else, and whatever message, quote unquote, they may or may not have. But this work is not only a work of art, because it talks about nature. It talks about the destruction of nature, the debris swimming and floating in the channel. It talks about the dangers of nature. And of course, the confluence, it might seem like a gimmick only, but of course, anything and everything in a novel that might seem like a gimmick is always more than a gimmick in the hands of a serious author. So even the a bit crowded bit, it's funny, but at the same time, it's serious in the sense that it brings in Charles, the two Charleses, Charles the protagonist and Charles the present King of England, and his then wife, Diana, in whose name dying is already implied in the very name Diana. So all of this factors into your novel, is my reading anyway. How does this, all of these larger things, this, the social commentary that it also provides by virtue of all of these illusions, how does this factor into the love story, the polyamorous love story, the initiation process that Charles himself lives through, his interest in the minutiae of life and life forms? And that means also the history of life and life forms. How does all of this play out in the actual story or play into it?
Yeah, in many ways, I suppose. What comes to my mind now foremost is being someone who does research into the microbiological processes, which mean that our cells are alive, that they function, and that they communicate, also means that Charles is someone who is confronted with amazing questions, like how does a single cell know anything? Does this question make sense at all? How does it behave on its own? How does communication happen within our bodies? This is his research. And as a subject, as a husband, he's a father as well, as a social being, he experiences all the layers of being in life, as Rebecca put it so beautifully, which we know, emotions and social obligations and questions of wills, freedom, liberty, and beginning and ends. And how can you can't find that if you stare into the glass and see the cell, how it's moving. And these are the questions he kind of asks the person he is, he takes along with himself. And his first motivation certainly is, he's looking for an answer for how to behave with this proposal and what to answer to Maud and how to kind of find a balance, a life balance again. So he is elderly, he's kind of 60-ish, but he's not at the end of his life. He's rethinking important parts of his life in order to live on. This is his task he's put to himself. And then he enters the water. And the very moment where he starts to swim, that was very palpable for me as a writer. There is this body as it is, the physics of being in the water, of swimming, gravity pulls at you and the waves toss you around. And at the same time, all the other things, the social realm has come along because there's a boat which is accompanying him and he has to interact with these people who now have to take care of his life. They are partly responsible for him. So the social dimension swims next to him visibly. And he's entered the water and metaphysical questions have opened up as well. Because just imagine, there you are, you've been swimming for, let's say, 20 hours. You hardly feel parts of your body you can't feel anymore. And you are in that kind of, that monotonous mechanism almost of moving your arms and legs in order not to drown. And then you start to realize beneath me, there are hundreds of meters of water and darkness. Above me, there are thousands of meters of darkness and there is a sky. What am I doing here? And who am I? And what I'm doing here in the water? And so it even only the kind of natural setting kind of re-evokes situations of birth and death, or the images which we use in our culture. So it's only kind of natural for Charles as well to sense it, or for you as a reader to sense it. And in the end, it's quite a suspenseful enterprise. I mean, if you do that all the channel swimmers to whom I talked always said to me, they were obsessed by that. They were waiting for their swim. And there was one question which was really important for them. Will I make it to the end? Will I reach France? And everybody knows that there is it's a dangerous enterprise. People die trying to cross the channel that way. So there is a background question. Will I make it at all? And this is how you enter the water. And when I had written the entire novel, first or second version, and I went through it again, I felt how that metaphysical dimension, how it had become alive to me as well. And there is a beginning, the first 30 pages, Charles is waiting for his swim, and he's in Dover on the beach and looking at the sea and so on, and is jogging because he needs to be fit. And there he's on the beach, and there's a man in the distance, or rather a person, a figure he sees, comes out of the water and then disappears with a kind of silver shimmer. And this is, for me, the first image of how the metaphysical questions of the novel kind of come into existence, so become words and things or movements or reflections.
Wonderful, thank you. I couldn't help thinking, and I would like Rebecca to read a little more in just a second. I couldn't help thinking in terms of having had only 2 similar experiences recently in terms of the metaphysics of the sea, or something that has to do with creatures, pre-amphibian creatures coming out of the sea, and this image that you just mentioned, Ulrike, with the person appearing on the beach toward the beginning of the novel, is quite clearly larger than simply a person in a text. It has, significance by far exceeds its literal appearance. And it reminded me a lot of the experience I had, the entire novel, especially the ending, which I will not give away, obviously, the final scene of the movie Gravity, where Sandra Bullock reemerges from the water and starts learning to walk and to become human again. It's almost like humanity in reverse and a reset. And so there's a very cinematic reset quality to the novel. So as I read it, I saw it as a film already the whole time. We've been wondering, so who would play Charles as a young man, who would play Charles as the elderly Charles and such. And the social aspect, indeed, there's a class aspect too, right? There's Oxford, there's Britain, there are the different dialects, the different languages. There's also the continental versus the British. And when you said, will I reach France? Looking for chercher la femme as opposed to chercher la France. So there's so many aspects. It's such a rich novel, and it's short, barely 200 pages, depending on the typeface, obviously. But still, it's a short novel. And it's amazing what you packed into this little text. Rebecca, would you read a little more now that we've talked so much?
Sure, very happy to. And kind of picking up on lots of what we've been talking about, I think I've chosen a passage from kind of towards the end, but it doesn't give anything away, but it does show how everything is kind of feeding into everything else. What might Abby look like today? Maud, aged 62, was much more like her mother than Maud, aged 20. Perhaps the sisters too would have grown more alike. Maud, he considered, wasn't just pining for youth, wasn't just suffering the final throes of the menopause and its attendant vulnerabilities, or in the grip of a romantic dream. She wouldn't have needed Silas for any of that. Maud was pining for Abby. She didn't want Charles to leave forever. He was supposed to know, accept, and stay. She had been aiming to start a different kind of family, a family of 2 men and a Maud. For a Maud that then could be both, Abby and Maud. This, he now realised, had been the offer right from the start, the thing he had run away from. Charles the teaspoon. What did Maud wish for, even though she might not fully grasp it? What did she see without seeing through it? Where was she climbing to in her dreams? The sea's cauldrons were echoing. He still figured in Maud's dreams, this he was sure of, climbed up and down ladders with her. A bit crowded, our marriage, Diana, Princess of Wales, had said of her Charles and his Camilla, as she blinked with British understatement into the camera. Like the royals, they too had been a bit crowded right from the start, but in a wonderful variation. For them, 3 counted as downsizing. Floating shards, spontaneous explosions, final sparks. The last hour of the evening turned out to be a kind of destruction that left everything intact. What a drama queen this hour was, particularly at sea. Not happy until the central star had set in one of those all-round radiant displays that made it look like an orange-red spiky hedgehog. Yeah, you couldn't help but want to lament the beauty of it all. Another day over. Charles was simply light-hearted. The 18th hour, and he was swimming. The longest attempted swim of his life, the most awful, and the most lamentably beautiful. Donkey fuzz grey mats were besieging the horizon. The channel reflected a rust red on all its humps and lumps. Darkness already reigned in the hollows between. You could not call them troughs. The water was swirling, oily, flat. Unperturbed, the Henry, eager, trusty pounding engine that it was, cast its light straight ahead. Wherever the electric beam hit the water, depth was extinguished. Only the surface remained. The waves next to Charles, by contrast, were breathing. He counted his strokes, spoke to Maud. Orange stingrays of light were crossing the skies. Arms of darkness encircled one another at sea, each searching the other out. On the last feed he had replenished the Vaseline in his ears. It was like a plug. If Charles heard anything, it was the wind, the water, the pulsing inside him, his own heart. The beating root that had started to pump when he was still a tadpole, no brain, no spine, just a pile of reproductive cells. At the age of 10, Charles had gone through a spell of setting his alarm for 5 in the morning. The dead of night, an hour when even nocturnal hunters take a nap. As a student, he had got up at this time to study. He called it the hollow. Something came to rest, stretched out, softened. He was expecting this sensation to become more marked on water than on land as the night progressed, but unfortunately he no longer knew for sure what progress was. Black water, hollows between the waves, thick and dark like oil. Yet overall, the channel refused to grow properly dark. The English and French coasts, so near, threw lights to one another over the wedge of water. The ships crossing in all directions lit up all directions. The sky shone a dirty yellow. He swam. And swam. From feed to feed. Midnight came. He took 10 seconds extra. Chocolate. Tea. He swam. At irregular intervals, the whole surface of the sea rippled right across, as if fanned by a powerful bellows, the gentle sigh of a peaceful sleeper. Nothing as small as an animal or a human. The channel itself was the putative sleeper, troubled by the horrendous traffic that barely ever abated, not even at night. Charles listened to it all, his arms now tracing the swimming motion as if it were the most natural thing in the world, like breathing in your sleep. Between the waves bobbed his eyes, his self.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think we've given the future readers and the audience a very good sense of this beautiful, beautiful book that is coming out on April 29th. And we hope that it finds many, many readers, reviewers, acolytes, be they sea swimmers or simply lovers of England, Ireland, Oxford, King Charles and his family, English royalty. Thank you, Ulrike, for writing the book. And thank you both for participating today. And I think we should finish on this last note of having heard Ulrike's text in Rebecca's wonderful translation. Thank you both, and goodbye.